So I have a favorite poet. His name is Rudy Francisco, and he has said a lot of things that have held a lot of weight in my life. He's said a lot of things that have widened my lens on how I view experiences that are not my own. He said a lot of things that have stuck with me, but there's one thing that he said that always comes back around, and it's this. He said, "The only difference between a graveyard and a garden is what you choose to put in the ground." A few months ago, I heard this new song, a new worship song, and it loudly asserted this, that God turns graves into gardens. And this is a new song. It was hype. It was cool. And while this is good and true, I think there's a lot that's not said. I think there's a lot that's in between the lines. And in between the lines of this reality that God turns graves into gardens, and even in between the lines of my favorite words from my favorite poet, is the truth that the space between the graveyard and the garden is bigger than I think. And the journey from death to life is longer than I think. And the reality is that that space is overwhelmingly occupied by grief. We've been talking about grief a lot as a community. I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been feeling a lot of grief personally in my relationships and in my situation. And the more I think about it, it rings true that our humanity hinges on how we as people respond to grief. And when we run away from grief, the track record is not that great. See, from the very beginning, Adam ran away from the grief of his own selfishness, and that grief turned into shame, which projected blame onto his partner. His own kid, Cain, ran away from the grief of his inadequacy, and that lack of confronting his grief resulted in violence and blood and anger. The Israelites, over time, failed to come to terms with the grief of their own exile, and it turned into a religious system that ironically ended up oppressing others. And us today, if we fail to come to terms with the grief of how we treat the land and the poor and the foreigner, we're going to end up the same way. And this season, when I think about the disciples, their hopes and their dreams and their expectations died with Jesus. And they ran away from their grief and disappeared into the night and hid. All of these people ran away from grief. And when we skip out on the space between the graveyard and the garden, we miss out on the fact that most of life is actually lived in this space. The space between Good Friday and Easter. The space between our deepest tragedies and our richest joys. This is the space where we are most subject to grief. The past few weeks, coronavirus has forced us all into a place where we can actually confront our grief. The grief of losing hundreds of people's lives every day, the grief of losing our jobs and our businesses and our patterns, the grief of a broken and unprepared system, and the grief of isolation and separation. And in a culture where production and making more and doing more is God, it's so easy to miss out on the fact that we can actually confront our grief and slow down. If we rush into results, if we rush into resurrection, our grief, like all of these stories, can turn into a weapon that brings violence and abuse into our world. And if we run away and hide, we miss out on the reality that grief is actually a teacher, and her lessons can only come in the darkest and most painful times of night. You see, David got this in Psalm 139 when he said, "When I look to the heavens, God, you are there. Even when I make my bed in hell, you are there." See, David knew that he could find God and have a lesson to be learned in the heights and in the depths, in the day and in the night. So tonight, I'm letting grief be my mentor. I'm not rushing into resurrection. I'm letting stillness and uncertainty be my guides, and I'm coming to terms with the death of my own expectations. Because it's only when I embrace the night that I can be surprised by the morning.